Do you remember the cheap dinners that showed up on every table in the 1970s? The ones pulled from cans, boxes, and garden plots that somehow stretched to feed the whole family. They weren't glamorous, but they were warm, filling, and made with equal parts thrift and love. These are the meals that carried working-class families through hard times. 30 classics you'll never forget. Tuna noodle casserole. If you grew up in a working-class household in the 1970s, chances are you've met this humble casserole more than once. It didn't need introductions. It simply appeared on the table in a Pyrex dish, steaming and unapologetically beige. At its core, tuna noodle casserole was the child of convenience foods and frugality. Families leaned heavily on a few pantry staples: canned tuna, a couple cans of cream of mushroom soup, egg noodles, and maybe, if the stars aligned, a sprinkling of breadcrumbs or crushed potato chips on top for crunch. Preparation was less about culinary finesse and more about efficiency. Boil the noodles, stir in the tuna and soup, spread it all in a dish, and slide it into the oven until it bubbled into a creamy, salty mass. It was quick, filling, and most importantly, cheap. The smell of it wafting through the house often signaled the kind of week when the paycheck needed stretching and nobody was in the mood for fuss. There's a deep nostalgia wrapped up in this casserole. Kids might have groaned when they saw it on the table for the third time that month, but in hindsight, it was the taste of togetherness, of parents doing what they could to fill stomachs without breaking the bank. It was a dish that could make a family of 5 feel secure, even when money was tight. Today, it lives on in ironic TikTok videos and foodie blogs where it's remade with artisanal tuna, wild mushrooms, and handmade noodles. But let's be honest, no version, however gourmet, can replicate the original charm. Tuna noodle casserole was never about elegance. It was about resilience, about opening the pantry and turning not much into dinner. And that's a legacy that deserves a place at any table, avocado green or otherwise. Hamburger Helper. When Hamburger Helper hit the shelves in 1971, it wasn't just another boxed meal. It was salvation for working-class families, staring down a pound of ground beef and wondering how to make it stretch. The pitch was simple: 1 skillet, 1 box, and dinner was ready in under 30 minutes. For parents juggling long shifts, hungry kids, and tight budgets, this wasn't just convenient, it felt like magic. The smiling, white-gloved mascot helping hand became a household icon, cheerfully promising that dinner could be both easy and affordable. Inside the box, a pouch of dried pasta and a packet of seasoning dust that somehow transformed into a creamy, savory sauce once water, milk, and browned beef joined the party. It wasn't fancy, but when those noodles soaked up that neon orange sauce, it became pure comfort. Families gathered around the table, and for a brief moment, the stress of bills and gas shortages faded behind the sound of forks scraping plates. The genius of Hamburger Helper was how democratic it was. You didn't need cooking skills or exotic ingredients, just a skillet and some ground meat. It was food that belonged to everyone: suburban moms, single dads, college kids, and blue-collar workers alike. Sure, kids sometimes rolled their eyes at the repetitive menu, but it was hard to argue with a dinner that fed 5 people for less than $2. Fast forward to today, and Hamburger Helper has achieved retro status. Foodies reinvent it with grass-fed beef and organic cheese, while TikTok creators ironically rave about gourmet helper. Yet, the boxed original still has a quiet dignity. It represents the 70s dinner table in all its scrappy resilience, equal parts necessity, invention, and a dash of powdered cheese. It wasn't haute cuisine, it was survival with a smile, served family style. Spam fried rice. Spam fried rice may sound like a punchline to some today, but in the 1970s, it was nothing short of genius. Born out of wartime rationing and carried proudly into working-class kitchens, Spam was cheap, shelf-stable, and, believe it or not, beloved. Cans of the pink, salty, block-lined pantry shelves, waiting to be transformed into something greater than the sum of its parts. Fried rice, already a thrifty dish that stretched leftovers into a full meal, became the perfect stage for Spam to shine. The preparation was as unfussy as life demanded. Dice the Spam into little cubes, toss them in a hot skillet until the edges crisped into golden perfection, then add day-old rice, a splash of soy sauce, maybe a handful of frozen peas or carrots if the budget allowed. A fried egg on top turned it from a side into a dinner that felt filling and, in its own way, celebratory. The smell of sizzling Spam mingled with rice was the kind of aroma that announced, yes, dinner is happening and it's going to taste good. For many immigrant families, Spam fried rice wasn't just a budget-friendly option, but a cultural bridge. It carried echoes of Pacific Islands, military bases, and bustling Asian American households where every grain of rice mattered. In working-class America at large, it was proof that you didn't need steak or fancy roast to feel satisfied. Today, Spam enjoys an unlikely renaissance, headlining Hawaiian BBQ plates, popping up in sushi rolls, and even appearing on gourmet brunch menus. But the heart of Spam fried rice isn't about trendiness. It's about resilience, about making a can of processed meat into something that felt warm, filling, and loved. In a world where fusion food is now celebrated, Spam fried rice was doing it decades ago, quietly, cheaply, and deliciously. Sloppy Joes. If there was ever a meal that captured the messy joy of 1970s family dinners, it had to be Sloppy Joes. They were the ultimate Friday night special, a sandwich that required no silverware, no ceremony, and, if you were a kid, absolutely no napkins until your mother forced one into your hand. At its core, the Sloppy Joe was simply browned ground beef simmered in a sweet and tangy tomato-based sauce, spooned onto a soft hamburger bun. But that simplicity was exactly what made it a weeknight hero. The sauce often came from a can of Manwich, that bright orange staple of every working-class pantry. A sandwich is a sandwich, but a manwich is a meal, the commercials boasted. And for a lot of families, it was true. With just a pound of ground beef, some buns, and a can of sauce, dinner could stretch to feed a whole table. Kids didn't care if the filling dripped down their arms, they reveled in it. Parents didn't care if the meal was neat. It was fast, cheap, and filling. There was something communal about eating Sloppy Joes. They weren't elegant or pretentious, but they carried a spirit of togetherness. The very act of leaning over your plate to keep the sandwich from falling apart bonded you with everyone else at the table doing the same. It was democracy in dinner form. Everyone's hands equally sticky, everyone equally satisfied. Today, Sloppy Joes still pop up at potlucks and school cafeterias, though sometimes reinvented with brioche buns or ground turkey. Foodies call them loose meat sandwiches, as if renaming them erases the ketchup-sweet nostalgia. But the truth is, no rebrand can beat the joy of the original. Sloppy Joes were never about being polished. They were about flavor, family, and the freedom to be a little messy. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze. Few dishes scream working-class 1970s dinner table louder than meatloaf crowned with its glossy red ketchup glaze. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable, and for many families, that was exactly the point. At its heart, meatloaf was the art of stretching a single pound or two of ground beef into something hearty enough to feed 5 or 6 mouths. Breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even oats were mixed in to bulk it up, while eggs bound the whole thing together. The loaf was shaped by hand, placed in a battered pan, and slathered with a thick coat of ketchup before sliding into the oven. That glaze was more than just a topping. It was the hallmark of the dish, caramelizing into a sweet, tangy layer that kids either adored or tried to scrape off. The smell of it baking filled the entire house, the kind of aroma that announced to everyone, "So dinner's on, come gather." Slices were served with mashed potatoes or maybe some canned green beans, creating a plate that was as predictable as it was comforting. Emotionally, meatloaf represented stability. Even when times were tight, parents could serve a dish that felt like a proper centerpiece, the closest many working-class households came to a roast during the week. It was food meant to fill stomachs and reassure families that things would be okay. Of course, kids sometimes complained it wasn't exciting. It was just meatloaf. But years later, those same kids would crave it with the same nostalgia as a favorite childhood song. Today, meatloaf still pops up on diner menus and in gastropubs, sometimes fancied up with gourmet glazes or artisanal breadcrumbs. But the classic 1970s version endures because it was never about style. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze was about feeding people with love, thrift, and a little sweetness baked on top. TV dinners. In the 1970s, nothing captured the collision of modern convenience and working-class necessity quite like the TV dinner. Packaged neatly in compartmentalized foil trays, they promised a full meal with zero fuss. Just slide the tray into the oven, wait for the timer to ding, and voila. Turkey with stuffing, peas and carrots, mashed potatoes, and a square of mystery dessert, all served in their own little sections. It was culinary efficiency in a box, and for many families, it felt like a small miracle after a long day of work. The TV dinner wasn't born in the 70s. It first appeared in the 1950s, but by the time disco was king, these frozen feasts had secured their place in working-class freezers across America. Moms juggling jobs outside the home embraced them as a way to get dinner on the table without dirtying a sink full of dishes. Kids loved the novelty of choosing between Salisbury steak or fried chicken, each nestled in foil compartments like treasures. And of course, the name said it all. Dinner could now be eaten in front of the television, the new hearth of the modern household. Were they good? That's debatable. The mashed potatoes could be gluey, the vegetables a little soggy, and the dessert often tasted like sweetened cardboard. But none of that mattered in the moment. What mattered was that dinner was hot, filling, and ready with minimal effort. For many working-class families, it was the closest thing to eating out, without the price tag. Today, TV dinners are sometimes mocked, sometimes celebrated as retro kitsch, and occasionally reinvented as frozen entrees with organic labels. Yet their legacy remains. They represent a time when convenience was king, when feeding the family quickly mattered most, and when the TV tray wasn't just furniture, it was a symbol of changing American life. American goulash. American goulash was the unsung hero of the 1970s dinner table, a dish that managed to be cheap, filling, and oddly comforting all at once. Despite borrowing its name from the Hungarian classic, this version bore only a distant resemblance. Instead of paprika-scented stews and slow cooking, the Americanized version was a one-pot miracle made with elbow macaroni, ground beef, canned tomatoes or tomato sauce, and a shake of whatever dried spices were within reach. It was practical, unpretentious, and most importantly, able to feed a family of 6 without putting a serious dent in the grocery budget. Preparation was straightforward. Brown the ground beef with onions, stir in a can of tomatoes or sauce, and let the macaroni soak up all that tangy richness. Sometimes a sprinkle of garlic powder or Worcestershire sauce made its way in, but no two pots were exactly alike. Every family had its own twist, whether it was extra cheese melted on top or stretching the meat with a few more noodles than the recipe called for. The beauty of American goulash was that it didn't need to be exact. It was survival food disguised as comfort food. For kids, goulash was a bowl of warmth. something to wolf down before racing back outside or sprawling in front of the television. For parents, it was peace of mind, a meal that could be cooked quickly, stretched easily, and stored for leftovers. Even its name carried a sort of everyday charm, like the dish itself didn't take itself too seriously. Today, American goulash lives on in church potlucks, TikTok budget recipes, and the memory banks of anyone who grew up with it as a weeknight staple. It's a reminder that food doesn't have to be fancy to matter. Sometimes, all you need is a pot, some pasta, and the will to make dinner stretch a little further. Tuna patties. In the 1970s, when budgets were stretched tighter than a pair of polyester pants, tuna patties were a dinner that quietly saved the day. Cans of tuna were cheap, plentiful, and endlessly versatile, and homemakers across America knew how to turn them into something that felt like a real meal. Tuna patties, sometimes called tuna cakes or croquettes. How do you feed a hungry family with just a couple cans of fish and a few pantry staples? The method was simple and forgiving. Tuna was mixed with breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, bound together with an egg, and maybe a dollop of mayonnaise or mustard, then seasoned with whatever was available: onion, celery, even a splash of Worcestershire sauce if the bottle hadn't run dry. The mixture was shaped into patties and fried in a skillet until golden brown on the outside, tender on the inside, and deliciously salty all the way through. Paired with mashed potatoes or tucked between two slices of bread, these crispy little cakes made dinner feel complete without demanding much from the wallet. For kids, tuna patties often carried mixed emotions: half delight at the crispy fried edges, half suspicion at the unmistakable scent of canned tuna. But for parents, they represented resourcefulness, the ability to put something hearty on the table when grocery money was thin. There was comfort in their reliability. No matter how lean the week, tuna patties always came through. Today, tuna patties have been rediscovered as a kind of retro comfort food. Recipes online dress them up with fresh herbs, artisanal breadcrumbs, and lemon aioli. But the heart of the dish hasn't changed. It's still about turning the simplest of ingredients into something that feels like more than it is: a small, golden brown symbol of resilience and creativity from a decade that knew both well. Macaroni and cheese. If childhood in the 1970s had a flavor, for many it was the unmistakable tang of powdered cheese stirred into a pot of elbow macaroni. Macaroni and cheese was the democratic darling of the dinner table, equally at home as a main dish on a tight weeknight or a side at a Sunday potluck. Kraft's Blue Box was the reigning champion, offering parents a way to feed a crowd for pennies with only milk, butter, and a saucepan required. When that packet of neon orange powder dissolved into creamy sauce, it felt like alchemy, transforming plain noodles into something rich, filling, and oddly comforting. Of course, not every family stuck with the boxed version. Some made it from scratch, though even those scratch recipes often involved processed cheese, evaporated milk, or a can of cream soup. What mattered wasn't whether it was gourmet, it was whether it stretched far enough to fill plates and silence grumbling stomachs. Macaroni and cheese had a way of comforting without pretense, an edible reassurance that things might be tough outside, but inside you had something warm and familiar. Kids loved it naturally. It was creamy, carb-heavy, and mild enough to satisfy even picky eaters. Parents loved it too, though perhaps more for its thrift than its taste. It became the kind of dish that appeared again and again, never quite fancy, but always welcome. Leftovers, if there were any, reheated into something stickier, perhaps even more beloved the next day. Today, macaroni and cheese enjoys a double life. It's still a weeknight staple straight from the Blue Box, but it's also reinvented as a decadent comfort food topped with bacon, lobster, or artisanal cheeses. Yet, despite the gourmet glow-ups, Nothing truly eclipses the nostalgia of the 1970s bowl. Simple elbows, powdered cheese, and the sense that home was exactly where you were sitting. Chili with saltines. Chili in the 1970s wasn't the kind of carefully crafted, slow-simmered affair you see winning trophies at cook-offs today. It was hearty, quick, and straightforward. A dish designed to stretch a pound of ground beef into something that could feed a family of 5 with leftovers to spare. The recipe was rarely written down because everyone seemed to have their own version. Brown the beef, dump in a can or two of beans, stir in canned tomatoes or tomato sauce, and season it generously with chili powder. Sometimes onions or green peppers made an appearance if they were in the fridge, but often it was just the basics. A pot of red, bubbling on the stove, smelling like comfort. And then came the saltines. No bowl of chili was complete without a stack of those pale square crackers served right alongside. Some crumbled them directly into the bowl, letting them soak up the spicy tomato broth until they turned soft and thickened the chili. Others preferred to eat them on the side, crunching each bite to cut through the richness of the dish. For kids, balancing a saltine loaded with chili was practically an art form. And for parents, the crackers were a cheap way to stretch the meal even further. The emotional resonance of chili with saltines lay in its simplicity. It was a dish that worked for a busy weeknight, a cold winter evening, or even a Saturday gathering when neighbors dropped by. It carried no pretension, just a steaming pot and a sleeve of crackers shared around the table. Today, chili recipes are hotly debated, with arguments over beans versus no beans and toppings ranging from cheese to avocado. But in the 1970s, chili with saltines was less about culinary bragging rights and more about family, warmth, and making a modest pantry taste like abundance. Hot dog stew. Hot dog stew may not sound like a culinary triumph, but in the 1970s, it was a practical answer to an all-too-familiar question. How do you make dinner when there isn't much in the fridge? Hot dogs were cheap, plentiful, and always waiting in the refrigerator drawer, ready to become the star of the show. Families found ways to slice them up, toss them into a pot with potatoes, carrots, onions, and maybe a can of tomatoes or beans, and let it all simmer into something that felt hearty enough to fill a table of hungry kids. The beauty of hot dog stew was in its flexibility. Some versions leaned toward a vegetable soup with chopped celery, canned corn, or green beans floating alongside the hot dog rounds. Others were thicker, almost like a hash, with potatoes and onions carrying most of the weight. The hot dogs themselves acted like little bursts of salty, smoky flavor in every spoonful, transforming an otherwise modest soup into something oddly satisfying. It was food born out of necessity, but it came with a certain charm that only resourcefulness can create. For kids, there was joy in the novelty. Hot dogs usually meant cookouts or quick lunches, so seeing them bobbing in a stew pot felt both strange and exciting. Parents appreciated the ease. No special skills required, just a knife, a pot, and the willingness to improvise. More importantly, it stretched a package of hot dogs far beyond a plate of buns could. Today, hot dog stew might raise eyebrows in foodie circles, but it remains a nostalgic reminder of how families made do. In a decade marked by rising prices and economic uncertainty, it stood as proof that dinner didn't have to be fancy to be filling. Sometimes, thrift and creativity were the only spices you needed. Creamed chipped beef on toast. If ever there was a dish that embodied both resilience and resourcefulness in the 1970s kitchen, it was creamed chipped beef on toast, known affectionately, or not so affectionately, as SOS by soldiers in World War II. This humble meal found its way from military mess halls into working-class homes where it became a weeknight staple. The idea was simple. Take thin slices of dried beef, tear or chop them into bits, and simmer them in a creamy white sauce made from milk, butter, and flour. Poured generously over toast, it transformed into something that felt more substantial than its humble ingredients suggested. For many families, this dish was less about indulgence and more about survival. Dried beef was inexpensive and shelf-stable, a godsend when fresh meat wasn't an option. The white sauce stretched the protein, and the toast underneath made sure no one walked away from the table hungry. It was economical, quick to prepare, and surprisingly comforting. The salty bite of the beef balanced against the mild creaminess of the sauce, and the crisp toast beneath provided just enough texture to keep it interesting. To kids, the dish could be polarizing. Some loved its richness, others wrinkled their noses at the unfamiliar taste of dried beef. But years later, many would recall it with surprising fondness, a reminder of simpler times when meals weren't about flair but about filling stomachs. For parents, it was dependable, a way to serve something warm and hearty without spending much or requiring a trip to the store. Today, creamed chipped beef on toast occasionally resurfaces on diner menus or in nostalgic recipe blogs, often dressed up with fresh herbs or artisan bread. But its legacy isn't in fancy updates. It remains a symbol of thrift and ingenuity, proof that even the most modest ingredients can provide comfort when served with a little creativity and a lot of heart. Cabbage soup. Cabbage soup was one of those dishes that told the story of working-class survival in the 1970s without saying a word. Cheap, hearty, and endlessly adaptable, it became a staple in homes where stretching $1 was an everyday challenge. A single head of cabbage could be chopped into ribbons and simmered with onions, carrots, potatoes, and maybe a can of tomatoes, creating a pot that fed the whole family for days. Meat was optional, often replaced with bouillon cubes or scraps of ham bone if they happened to be around. What mattered most was that it was warm, filling, and could be ladled out again and again. The preparation was as straightforward as it gets. Slice, chop, toss it all in a pot, and let it simmer until the vegetables softened and the broth turned rich with cabbage sweetness. It wasn't glamorous. No one was bragging about cabbage soup at dinner parties, but it was dependable. Families who grew vegetables in backyard gardens or kept victory garden traditions alive found it especially useful. A single pot often lasted the better part of a week, reheated on the stove each night until the flavors deepened into something surprisingly satisfying. For kids, cabbage soup might not have been the most exciting meal. After all, vegetables rarely win popularity contests, but it carried a kind of quiet comfort. Parents served it with bread or crackers, sometimes stretching it even further by pouring it over rice. In a decade marked by inflation and uncertainty, it represented security, proof that a warm meal was possible even on the leanest budget. Today, cabbage soup has had an odd afterlife, rebranded as a crash diet fad in the 1980s and occasionally resurfacing in detox trends. But its real legacy isn't about weight loss. It's about resilience and creativity, about turning the humblest ingredients into a pot of nourishment that kept families going through tough times. Shepherd's pie. Shepherd's pie in the 1970s was the quintessential make-do dinner, the kind of dish that could turn a handful of leftovers and a box of instant mashed potatoes into something that felt like a feast. While its roots trace back to Ireland and Britain, where lamb and root vegetables were traditional, the American working-class version leaned heavily on what was affordable and accessible. Ground beef instead of lamb, canned or frozen peas and carrots, and instant potatoes whipped into fluffy clouds that blanketed the whole thing. It wasn't about authenticity. It was about making dinner stretch without anyone leaving the table hungry. The preparation had a rhythm families knew well. The The ground beef was browned with onions, maybe a splash of Worcestershire sauce for depth, and then stirred with vegetables and sometimes a can of tomato soup or gravy to hold it all together. That mixture went into a casserole dish, covered by a thick layer of mashed potatoes, often from a box, though no one complained, and baked until the top crisped into golden ridges. When it emerged from the oven, it looked like comfort incarnate, a dish that fed both body and spirit. For kids, shepherd's pie meant spoonfuls of creamy potato, giving way to savory beef and vegetables, a hidden treasure beneath the surface. For parents, it was the reassurance of a meal that could be made cheaply, quickly, and in large portions. It felt like a Sunday dinner brought into the middle of the week, proof that you didn't need a roast to gather the family around the table. Today, shepherd's pie gets dressed up with fresh herbs, artisanal cheese, and grass-fed beef. But the 1970s version remains a classic. It spoke to resilience and thrift, turning a few humble ingredients into something that tasted like comfort, care, and a little triumph over hard times. Egg salad sandwiches. In the 1970s, few meals were as unassuming, yet as essential as the egg salad sandwich. Eggs were cheap, filling, and always in the fridge, making them a go-to ingredient when grocery money ran thin. Turning them into egg salad was almost second nature. Boil a dozen, chop them up, mix with mayonnaise, a spoon of mustard, maybe some chopped celery or onion if it was on hand, and season with a dash of salt and pepper. Spread generously on soft white bread, it became a sandwich that managed to be both humble and satisfying, the kind of food that worked for dinner, school lunches, or a quick bite before heading to a late shift. The preparation was hardly glamorous, but it carried its own ritual. Boiling the eggs meant the house filled with that faint sulfur smell everyone instantly recognized, and peeling them was a task often delegated to kids eager to help. When the salad was finally mixed, it was creamy and tangy, a comfort spread that could stretch across a whole loaf of bread if needed. For families counting every dollar, it was a reliable way to put protein on the table without sacrificing taste. For children, egg salad sandwiches were a mixed bag. Some loved the smooth texture and rich flavor, while others turned up their noses at the smell. But even the picky eaters often came around when it was tucked between slices of Wonder Bread and cut into triangles, the universal signal of a proper sandwich. Parents appreciated its efficiency. A dozen eggs could provide several meals, and nothing went to waste. Today, egg salad has found its way back into cafes and recipe blogs, often dressed up with fresh herbs or artisanal breads. Yet the 1970s version remains timeless, a simple, affordable dish that spoke of care, practicality, and the quiet comfort of food made to fill and nourish. Bologna sandwiches. The bologna sandwich was the great equalizer of the 1970s working-class kitchen, a meal that required almost no effort yet carried an undeniable sense of familiarity. Bologna was cheap, endlessly available, and kept for ages in the fridge, making it the go-to option when paychecks were thin or time was short. A slice or two, slapped between soft white bread with a swipe of mayonnaise or mustard, became the kind of sandwich that showed up in countless lunch boxes and dinner plates alike. For kids, it was a fixture of school lunches. For parents, it was a safety net, proof that nobody would go hungry even when the grocery list had been cut down to bare bones. Fried bologna sandwiches added another layer of charm. Tossing a round of bologna into a hot skillet meant it puffed and curled at the edges, turning into a salty, crispy-edged slice of pure nostalgia. Topped with cheese and tucked into bread, it became something close to indulgent, even if it was made from the humblest of ingredients. The smell of sizzling bologna was unmistakable, a signal that dinner was just minutes away. The sandwich carried more than just flavor. It carried a story of thrift and adaptability. Bologna was working-class charcuterie, the cold cut that stood in for pricier deli meats without apology. Families ate it cold, fried, stacked high, or pared down to a single slice, always with the sense that it was enough. Today, bologna has been rebranded in some circles, with foodies experimenting with artisanal or thick-cut versions, but the soul of the sandwich hasn't changed. In the 1970s, it wasn't about trends or reinvention. It was about making a simple, affordable ingredient work overtime. The bologna sandwich endures because it represents exactly what those kitchens were built on: resourcefulness, comfort, and the quiet dignity of a meal that did its job. Salisbury steak. Salisbury steak in the 1970s was a dish that pretended to be fancier than it really was, and that was part of its charm. At its core, it was little more than seasoned ground beef shaped into oval patties and smothered in brown gravy. Yet for many working-class families, it felt like a step up from plain hamburger night. The name itself carried a sense of elegance, as if this humble dinner were something you might order in a restaurant instead of pulling from a battered Pyrex or a foil TV dinner tray. The recipe was straightforward and forgiving. Ground beef was mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings, sometimes onion soup mix for an extra punch, before being formed into patties and pan-fried or baked. What elevated it wasn't the meat itself, but the gravy, usually a rich, salty blend of canned broth or bouillon cubes, thickened with flour. Ladled generously over the patties, the sauce transformed them from simple hamburgers into something that felt indulgent, even if it cost just a few dollars to make. Salisbury steak became especially famous through TV dinners, where it often occupied the center compartment paired with mashed potatoes, peas, and a tiny square of dessert. While the frozen versions sometimes left much to be desired, the homemade kind carried a special warmth. Parents appreciated how far the dish could stretch, feeding a big family with minimal fuss, while kids relished the comfort of gravy-soaked bites alongside familiar sides. Today, Salisbury steak is often remembered with a mix of fondness and humor, sometimes reimagined in gastropubs with gourmet mushrooms and red wine sauce. But its legacy lies in the kitchens of the 1970s, where it served as proof that a little imagination and a lot of gravy could turn ground beef into a meal that felt like more than the sum of its parts. Jell-O salad with suspicious add-ins. No dish better captures the strange culinary experiments of the 1970s than the infamous Jell-O salad, especially those versions studded with ingredients that seemed more like dares than recipes. A shimmering mold of lime or lemon Jell-O, filled with shredded carrots, pineapple chunks, or even celery, was a fixture at potlucks, church suppers, and family gatherings. In some households, cream cheese or cottage cheese made an appearance, creating a strange, wobbly hybrid that was neither quite sweet nor entirely savory. It was as if America, intoxicated by the wonders of convenience foods, collectively decided that gelatin could and should be the canvas for everything. Preparation was straightforward but oddly ceremonial. Powdered Jell-O was dissolved in boiling water, cooled slightly, and then poured over the chosen add-ins arranged in a mold or glass dish. Hours in the refrigerator transformed it into a firm, quivering masterpiece, unveiled with pride and sometimes a touch of nervous laughter. Children would poke it with spoons, fascinated by its jiggle, while adults gamely took a slice, pretending not to notice the shredded vegetables trapped inside. Despite its oddities, Jell-O salad carried a sense of occasion. It was colorful, eye-catching, and inexpensive to make. The kind of dish that allowed a hostess to contribute something that looked festive even when budgets were slim. It fit the 1970s aesthetic perfectly: playful, experimental, and unapologetically processed. Today, Jell-O salads are often remembered with affectionate ridicule, the subject of family jokes and retro cookbooks. Yet there's a certain nostalgia attached to them too. They remind us of a time when creativity in the kitchen was about making do with what was at hand, and when even the strangest combinations were offered in the spirit of generosity and community. Wobbly, sweet, and just a little bizarre, Jell-O salads remain unforgettable. Chicken and rice bake. In the 1970s, when convenience reigned and every pantry seemed to hold a few cans of Campbell's soup, chicken and rice bake became a weeknight hero. It was the kind of dish that embodied the era's love affair with casseroles. Simple, filling, and endlessly adaptable. Families could count on it to feed everyone at the table without demanding much in terms of cost or effort. A couple of chicken pieces, thighs or drumsticks, were common since they were cheaper than breasts. Rested atop a bed of uncooked rice mixed with cream of mushroom or cream of chicken soup, then baked slowly until everything melded into one cohesive dish. The preparation was deceptively easy. Rice went into the casserole dish raw, joined by cans of condensed soup and a splash of water or broth to make sure it all cooked through. Chicken was laid on top, sometimes seasoned with nothing more than salt and pepper, other times dusted with paprika for a little color. As it baked, the rice absorbed both the liquid and the chicken's juices, becoming tender, creamy, and packed with flavor. By the time it came out of the oven, the house was filled with the unmistakable aroma of something hearty and comforting. For parents, chicken and rice bake was a blessing. It stretched a few inexpensive ingredients into a full meal, often with enough leftovers to reheat the next day. For kids, it was the definition of comfort food. Tender chicken nestled against soft, savory rice, the kind of meal that felt like a hug on a plate. Today, you'll still find countless versions of chicken and rice bake, dressed up with fresh herbs, artisan mushrooms, or long-grain specialty rice. Yet the 1970s version remains iconic, a dish that proved thrift and convenience could come together in a single, bubbling casserole to nourish both body and spirit. Fish sticks with tartar sauce. In the 1970s, fish sticks were the closest many working-class families came to serving seafood on a weeknight. They came neatly packed in the freezer aisle, breaded little rectangles that promised crispiness on the outside and flaky white fish on the inside, though exactly what kind of fish was never really the point. For parents, they were affordable, convenient, and quick. For kids, they were fun, easy to dip, and far less intimidating than a whole fillet. Fish sticks didn't try to be fancy. They were a meal that went from oven tray to dinner plate in under half an hour, making them a lifesaver after long days at work or school. Preparation was practically foolproof. Spread the frozen sticks on a baking sheet, slide them into the oven, and wait for the breading to crisp and turn golden. Meanwhile, tartar sauce, sometimes from a jar, sometimes cobbled together from mayonnaise and pickle relish, waited on the table as the essential companion. The pairing was magic. Salty, crunchy fish sticks dunked into tangy, creamy sauce. A combination that managed to feel indulgent, even though it was as cheap and easy as food could get. For children, fish sticks were often a favorite, rare moment when seafood didn't mean mysterious bones or fishy flavors. They were finger food, perfectly sized for dipping contests and after-dinner negotiations over who got the last one. For parents, the sticks provided reassurance, a hot dinner with protein, minimal cleanup, and no risk of complaints. Today, fish sticks are still tucked away in supermarket freezers, though they've been reimagined with panko coatings, gluten-free options, or wild-caught labels. Yet their legacy remains strongest in memory. In the 1970s, fish sticks with tartar sauce weren't just food. They were a small victory for families trying to put something reliable, tasty, and affordable on the table. Leftover hash. In the 1970s, leftover hash was the definition of kitchen thrift, a meal that refused to let even a single scrap go to waste. It was never really one dish, so much as a method, a way to gather the odds and ends from the fridge, yesterday's roast, a half cup of vegetables, a few lonely potatoes, and transform them into something hearty enough to stand on its own. For working-class families trying to stretch every dollar, hash wasn't just practical, it was a small act of creativity, turning scraps into supper with a sizzle of the skillet. The preparation was as casual as its origins. Cold potatoes, often boiled or baked from the night before, were chopped into cubes and fried until they crisped at the edges. Bits of meat were added, ham, roast beef, or even hot dogs. And then whatever vegetables were left over found their way into the pan. Onions were almost always included, bringing sweetness and depth, while a fried egg on top elevated the dish into something that felt intentional, even celebratory. The sound of hash frying in butter or oil was enough to draw everyone into the kitchen, the smell promising comfort despite its humble ingredients. For parents, leftover hash meant less waste and less worry, the satisfaction of feeding a family well without another trip to the store. For kids, it was a kind of treasure hunt on the plate, each bite a surprise combination of flavors from the week's meals. No two hashes were ever exactly the same, and that unpredictability became part of the charm. Today, hash appears on brunch menus dressed up with chorizo, sweet potatoes, or artisanal vegetables, but its soul hasn't changed. In the 1970s, it stood as proof that thrift and resourcefulness could be just as satisfying as any planned recipe, making leftovers taste like new beginnings. Mystery casserole. Every working-class kitchen in the 1970s had its own version of the mystery casserole, a dish that was less a recipe and more a survival tactic. It began with a simple premise: open the pantry, check the fridge, and gather whatever odds and ends were left. A can of cream of mushroom soup? In it went. Half a bag of egg noodles? Toss them in. A stray can of tuna. Chopped vegetables that were on their last leg. Or even leftover meatloaf from earlier in the week. Nothing was too unusual to find its way into the mix. Once topped with breadcrumbs or shredded cheese, the concoction went into the oven and came out as dinner, steaming and unashamedly improvised. The beauty of mystery casserole was its flexibility. There was no wrong way to make it because it was defined by what you had, not what you lacked. Preparation was quick. Cook the starch, stir in protein, bind it together with a condensed soup or some milk and eggs, and bake until the top browned and the inside bubbled. For parents, it was a reliable way to stretch a handful of ingredients into a meal that felt filling and, at least on the surface, intentional. For kids, the experience was unpredictable. Sometimes it was delicious, creamy, and cheesy. Other times it was puzzling, with strange textures and unexpected flavors. But either way, it filled stomachs and kept the family moving forward. What made the mystery casserole memorable wasn't perfection, but persistence. It symbolized a kitchen philosophy rooted in thrift and resilience, wasting nothing, making something out of scraps, and feeding a family on ingenuity alone. Today, it might be called a pantry clean-out bake or a kitchen sink casserole, but in the 1970s, it was simply survival disguised as supper, with love baked right in. Beanie weenies. If there was ever a dish that defined childhood in a working-class 1970s kitchen, it was beanie weenies. The name itself was playful enough to earn a smile, and the meal behind it was as simple as it sounds. Pork and beans from a can, simmered with sliced hot dogs, sometimes dressed up with ketchup, mustard, or a drizzle of molasses for sweetness. It was dinner that asked for no special equipment, no complicated instructions, and hardly any money. For parents, it was the quickest way to put protein and carbs on the table. For kids, it was a plate of pure comfort, salty, sweet, and just a little mischievous. The preparation hardly took more than 10 minutes. A saucepan on the stove, a can opener at the ready, and dinner was nearly finished before the kids could wash their hands. Hot dogs, cut into rounds, softened in the bubbling beans, releasing a smoky flavor that gave the dish more depth than its humble ingredients promised. Served with white bread, cornbread, or even just on its own, Beanie Weenies managed to feel like a complete meal, even if it looked more like an accident than a recipe. For many families, this dish carried emotional weight far greater than its cost. It represented resourcefulness, the ability to stretch a package of hot dogs and a can of beans into something everyone could share. It was also a favorite of children who saw it not as a desperate meal, but as a treat. Something fun, almost indulgent even when money was tight. Today, Beanie Weenies have mostly slipped into nostalgia, though they still pop up at campfires, church potlucks, and retro recipe blogs. They remind us that sometimes the simplest meals, born out of necessity, leave the warmest and most lasting memories. Grilled cheese and tomato soup. Few dinners in the 1970s carried as much cozy charm as grilled cheese and tomato soup. It was the kind of meal that showed up on rainy afternoons or busy weeknights when parents needed something fast, inexpensive, and guaranteed to please. White bread, butter, and a few slices of American cheese were all it took to transform a simple sandwich into golden, gooey comfort. Add a can of Campbell's tomato soup simmering on the stove, thinned with water or milk depending on what was on hand, and you had a pairing that felt both humble and iconic. The preparation was ritualistic in its simplicity. Buttered bread went into the skillet, cheese melting slowly between the slices until the bread crisped to a perfect crunch. Meanwhile, the soup bubbled softly in a pot, filling the kitchen with its sweet, tangy aroma. Together, they formed a duet greater than the sum of its parts. The crisp bite of the sandwich gave way to molten cheese, and dipping it into the hot tomato soup turned every bite into a small moment of bliss. For kids, grilled cheese and tomato soup was pure magic. It was easy to eat, fun to dunk, and impossible to dislike. For parents, it was affordable, quick to prepare, and nourishing enough to pass for a complete dinner. The pairing carried with it a sense of warmth that wasn't just physical but emotional, a reassurance that no matter how lean the pantry looked, comfort could still be conjured with just a loaf of bread, a block of cheese, and a can of soup. Today, this classic has been elevated with artisanal breads, fancy cheeses, and roasted tomato bisques. But the heart of the dish hasn't changed. In the 1970s, it was the edible equivalent of a hug, simple, affordable, and endlessly comforting. Stuffed bell peppers. In the 1970s, stuffed bell peppers stood out as one of those dinners that looked impressive without costing a fortune. They were colorful, hearty, and versatile, a dish that let working-class families take a handful of basic ingredients and transform them into something that felt like a proper centerpiece. Bell peppers, green more often than red or yellow, since those were cheaper, were hollowed out and filled with a mixture of ground beef, rice, tomato sauce, and seasonings before being baked until tender. When they came out of the oven, steaming and slightly caramelized around the edges, they had the look of something far fancier than their humble origins. The preparation was straightforward but felt a little ceremonious. Rice was cooked or sometimes recycled from yesterday's meal. Ground beef was browned with onions or garlic, and everything was mixed with tomato sauce to bind it together. The peppers, once seeded and hollowed, became edible containers, patiently holding the savory filling as it baked. A sprinkle of cheese on top, if the budget allowed, made them even more enticing, though plenty of families went without. Served alongside bread or a simple salad, stuffed peppers were the kind of meal that stretched a pound of meat into something that could satisfy an entire family. For parents, this dish carried a sense of pride. It wasn't just cheap, it looked good, felt substantial, and tasted like care. For kids, stuffed peppers could be hit or miss. Some loved the juicy combination of beef and rice, while others tried to eat the filling and leave the pepper shell behind. But whether loved or tolerated, it became a weeknight staple. Today, stuffed peppers appear in countless variations, from vegetarian quinoa versions to upscale restaurant plates. Yet the 1970s stuffed bell pepper remains iconic, a thrifty dish that turned a few ingredients into something comforting, nourishing, and memorable: instant ramen. In the 1970s, instant ramen was still something of a novelty in many American kitchens, but for working-class families, it quickly became a pantry staple. Imported first from Japan in the late 1950s and embraced more widely in the following decades, those colorful packets promised a hot, filling meal for mere pennies. All it took was boiling water, a block of curly noodles, and a silver packet of seasoning powder that managed to taste both salty and savory enough to pass for a full dinner. For parents juggling bills and busy schedules, ramen was a lifesaver. For kids, it was fun, watching those hard noodles soften and unravel. In the pot felt like magic. The preparation couldn't have been easier. A saucepan of water, a few minutes on the stove, and dinner was ready. Some families ate it straight as instructed, while others added their own embellishments: an egg cracked into the bubbling broth, a few frozen peas, maybe leftover bits of chicken or pork if they were lucky. But even on its own, ramen had the power to silence hunger quickly, cheaply, and with minimal cleanup. Its very simplicity made it versatile, a blank canvas for creativity, or a straightforward meal in a pinch. For many children of the 70s, ramen was tied to late-night snacks, after-school hunger pangs, or quick dinners when parents were too tired to cook. It represented independence too, one of the first meals kids could make on their own with just a stove and a pot. For adults, it was a quiet relief, a reminder that even in lean weeks, something hot and filling could be placed on the table without worry. Today, ramen has been elevated into restaurant fare, with gourmet broths and elaborate toppings. Yet the humble 1970s packet remains iconic, a symbol of thrift, resourcefulness, and comfort in its simplest, most affordable form: potato pancakes. Potato pancakes in the 1970s were a perfect example of how working-class families stretched simple ingredients into something hearty and satisfying. Potatoes were cheap, plentiful, and endlessly adaptable, and when grated and fried into crisp, golden cakes, they became a dinner that felt both thrifty and indulgent. Known in some families by their old-world names like latkes or kartoffelpuffer, they had been brought over by immigrant traditions but quickly made themselves at home on American tables. By the time they reached the dinner plates of the 70s, they were less about heritage and more about practicality: how to turn a sack of potatoes into a meal that fed everyone. The preparation was straightforward but required a little elbow grease. Potatoes were peeled and grated by hand, often with onions mixed in for bite, then combined with eggs and flour to bind them together. The mixture was spooned into sizzling oil, flattening into cakes that crisped beautifully on the outside while staying tender inside. The sound of frying and the smell of browning potatoes filled the kitchen, a sensory promise of something comforting and warm. Served with applesauce or sour cream, depending on what was available, they walked the line between savory and sweet. For parents, potato pancakes were a way to stretch the week's groceries, ensuring that even if the meat supply was thin, dinner could still be filling. For kids, they were a treat, crispy, salty, and fun to eat by hand if no one was watching. They carried with them a kind of celebratory air, even when they were born out of frugality. Today, potato pancakes remain beloved in both cultural traditions and modern brunch menus. But in the 1970s, they were more than a side dish or novelty. They were proof that the simplest ingredients, when treated with care and a hot skillet, could create a meal that satisfied hunger and warmed the spirit. Spanish rice. Spanish rice in the 1970s was one of those meals that could make a single pot of rice feel like a feast. For working-class families, rice was an affordable staple, And turning it into Spanish rice meant stretching it with flavor, color, and just enough protein or vegetables to make it stand on its own. The dish wasn't authentically Spanish, of course. It was more of a Tex-Mex inspired creation that had filtered its way into American kitchens, carried by community cookbooks, church suppers, and the simple fact that it was inexpensive, filling, and endlessly adaptable. Preparation usually started with onions and green peppers sautéed in a skillet, releasing that familiar sweet aroma that promised something good was coming. Rice was added and toasted lightly before canned tomatoes, tomato sauce, or even a jar of salsa gave it its signature red hue. Seasonings like chili powder, garlic, or cumin added depth, though many families kept it as simple as salt and pepper. Sometimes browned ground beef was stirred in to transform the dish into a full meal, while other times it remained vegetarian, a hearty side that could stretch a plate of chicken or pork chops further. For families, Spanish rice carried the sense of a meal that felt bigger than its ingredients. It was warm, savory, and comforting, a dish that could be scooped generously onto plates and always seemed to multiply in the pot. For kids, it was a softer introduction to spices and bold flavors, a little exotic compared to plain rice, but still familiar enough to enjoy. Today, Spanish rice still appears in kitchens and restaurants, often paired with tacos, enchiladas, or beans. But in the 1970s, it wasn't about restaurant-style sides. It was about thrift and ingenuity, a way to make rice taste exciting while feeding a family on a tight budget. Zucchini bread and fritters. In the 1970s, zucchini seemed to grow faster than families could eat it. Backyard gardens and neighborhood vegetable swaps often left kitchens overflowing with the long green squash, and thrifty homemakers had to get creative. Enter zucchini bread and fritters, two ingenious ways of transforming surplus into something that felt special. Zucchini bread was moist, lightly sweet, and spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg, a quick bread that could be eaten at breakfast, as a snack, or even as dessert. Fritters, on the other hand, were savory, crispy patties of grated zucchini mixed with flour, eggs, and seasoning, fried until golden brown and served hot from the skillet. Together, these dishes became staples of summer abundance and autumn practicality. The preparation of zucchini bread was almost meditative. Shredded zucchini was folded into batter, disappearing into the mix and lending moisture without drawing much attention to itself. Baked in loaf pans, it emerged with a golden crust and a tender crumb, often sliced thick and slathered with butter. Fritters were less patient, but just as beloved. A bowl of grated zucchini, a little salt, an egg, and a dusting of flour was all it took. Dropped into sizzling oil, the patties crisped around the edges, filling the kitchen with that unmistakable smell of frying comfort food. For parents, these recipes were salvation. No more guilt about garden surplus or produce going to waste. For kids, zucchini bread was a revelation, the vegetable hidden so cleverly in something sweet that they forgot they were eating it at all. Fritters, meanwhile, were fun finger food, crunchy on the outside and soft within. Today, zucchini bread is still a beloved bake sale favorite, and fritters appear on brunch menus dressed with herbs and fancy dips. But in the 1970s, they were simply proof that resourcefulness could make even a flood of zucchini taste like abundance rather than burden. And there you have it, 30 cheap dinners that kept 1970s families full, connected, and a little creative in the kitchen. They weren't fancy, but they were comforting, and they remind us that good food doesn't have to cost a fortune. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, don't forget to hit that like button, share this with someone who grew up on these meals, and subscribe for more nostalgic food stories. Your support keeps the table set for more.